It had been a long time since I'd needed a break, but when the opportunity presented itself, I jumped at it. The plan was simple enough. Head to my late uncle's cabin in the woods, a place I'd only ever heard stories about, but never visited. It sat on a small stretch of land that bordered a dense, untouched forest. The weather was supposed to be clear for the weekend, so the thought of a peaceful, quiet retreat seemed like the perfect escape. Little did I know my decision would bring me face to face with more than just solitude. I arrived at the cabin late on a Thursday afternoon, the gravel driveway crunching under my tires as I pulled up. The cabin looked just like it had been described to me, small, weathered, and secluded. It was built with old timber, its shingles moss-covered and darkened by the years. There was no electricity here, and the only light came from the flickering flame of a wood stove inside. I'd heard my uncle used to come here to escape from everything. His stressful job, the constant noise of the city, and perhaps the burdens of his own thoughts. It seemed peaceful enough. I didn't mind the lack of modern amenities. The phone had no signal and there was no Wi-Fi, but I wasn't interested in distractions. I wanted nothing more than to sit by the fire, read, and relax. I unloaded my bags, set up the essentials for a few days in the wilderness, and took a moment to absorb the stillness of the place. The air was cool, and the scent of pine trees hung heavy in the atmosphere, mixed with the dampness of the earth. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call far in the distance. It felt isolated, which was exactly what I needed. By the time evening rolled around, the rain had started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, but as night fell, it grew heavier. I built a fire inside and watched the flames dance in the stone hearth. The cabin creaked and groaned with the wind, but it wasn't unsettling. It was just the wood shifting, the house settling in for the storm. As the rain tapped against the cabin windows, I settled into my chair with a book. But there was something oddly unsettling about the stillness outside. It wasn't the usual silence that accompanied a storm. It felt as if the woods themselves were watching, listening. I brushed the thought away. It was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The first night passed without incident, but by the second day, things began to feel off. The rain had only gotten worse. The forecast I had checked before coming had promised scattered showers, but what I faced now was a relentless downpour. It didn't let up for hours. The rain pounded the roof and windows, and the low rumble of thunder echoed across the hills. I had gone for a walk earlier that morning, hoping to stretch my legs, but the forest was a maze of thick, dripping trees. The trail, though familiar from old maps, had become muddy and slick, and the wind howled through the branches as if urging me to turn back. I felt a sense of unease in the air, something that had started gnawing at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was just being alone out here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I had tried to dismiss it as paranoia. After all, what could possibly happen out here in the middle of nowhere? But the thought lingered. I decided to spend most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself from the growing tension. The cabin, for all its charm, had a peculiar aura, an unsettling quiet that seemed to amplify with the storm. The longer I stayed in the place, the more I noticed small things that I hadn't before. The way the floorboards creaked when no one was around. The strange noise that echoed from the walls, as though something were moving in the shadows. As the hours passed, I sat by the fire, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. It was early evening when I first heard it. A knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, the rain beating against the cabin in such a way that it sounded like a knock. But no, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. It was strange. Who would be out here, in the middle of a storm at this time of night? No one knew I was here, and my phone had no service, so there was no way for anyone to reach me. I slowly stood up, my legs stiff from sitting too long, and walked cautiously toward the door. My hand hovered over the old brass handle. I knew I should have felt nervous, but a strange curiosity urged me to open it. I cracked the door open, just enough to peer out. The rain lashed against my face as I squinted into the darkness. There was no one in sight, The porch was empty. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning. I stepped outside, the wet earth squelching beneath my boots, and looked around. Nothing. The storm had picked up, and the sound of rain and wind drowned out any other noises. I stood there for a moment, confused, before I closed the door and locked it. I didn't think too much of it at first. The storm played tricks on the mind, after all. But as I turned to head back to the fire, I noticed something strange. A fresh set of muddy footprints leading up to the door. They were large, way too large to be my own. The print was deep, as if someone had been standing there for a while. But there was no one around. I stared at the tracks for a long time, unsure of what to do. My mind raced. There had been no sign of anyone when I had stepped outside. No vehicles, no noise. I grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously around the cabin's perimeter. The footprints continued along the side, leading into the woods. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I followed them. But after a few yards, they stopped. It was as if whoever had been there had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened awareness. Every creak, every gust of wind seemed to make the walls groan, like someone or something was moving around just outside my reach. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't relax. The unease had settled deep into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, the rain had finally started to let up, though the sky remained heavy with dark clouds. I made coffee, trying to steady my nerves, and sat by the window, gazing out at the forest. The world seemed so quiet now, as though the storm had washed everything clean. But the calmness felt unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided I couldn't stay cooped up inside any longer. I had to do something, even if that meant going back out into the woods. The rain had stopped, and the trail was still muddy, but it wasn't as treacherous as before. I grabbed my jacket and set off into the woods, hoping the walk would clear my head. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere felt different. Heavier, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks dark and twisted. The path wound around thick underbrush, and the only sounds were the soft squelch of my boots in the mud and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. I didn't know what I expected to find out here, but the further I walked, the more I felt like I was being drawn in. There was something about this place, a strange, magnetic pull that made me want to venture deeper, to uncover whatever it was that had been nagging at my mind since I arrived. Then I saw it, a shape, half hidden by the trees, just off the path. At first, I thought it was just another tree, another odd formation in the underbrush. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was something else, something out of place. A tarp stretched over what appeared to be some sort of structure. It was crude, hastily constructed, and hidden just enough to blend into the woods. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. Something felt wrong about it, like it didn't belong. It was too close to the cabin, too close to where I had parked my car. Whoever had been out here, they were nearby. I crouched beside it, careful not to disturb the tarp. Slowly, I lifted one edge. Underneath, there was a pile of branches, a makeshift shelter, and a body. The body was slumped, its limbs twisted in an unnatural way. It was hard to make out the details in the dim light, but the sight made my stomach lurch. I recoiled, taking a step back. Whoever it was, they were clearly dead. There was no sign of life. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to flee back to the cabin and lock myself inside. But another part of me, curiosity, fear, or something else, urged me to stay, to investigate. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my mind spinning. It felt as though the ground was shifting under me, and every footstep took me further away from the safety I thought I had. I slammed the door shut behind me, heart pounding in my chest. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly in the cold, and the wind outside howled as though it too were warning me. I never found out what happened to the person in the woods. There were no more knocks at the door, no more strange footprints, nothing to explain the presence of the body. But the storm eventually passed. The rain ceased, and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The cabin sat on the edge of the woods like it had been forgotten. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a place for me to clear my head after a rough year. At least that's what I thought when I booked the place. A small, secluded spot in the forest just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The ad said it was cozy, a perfect retreat from the hustle of city life. And honestly, I needed the break. When I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon. The air was thick with humidity, a typical August evening in the mountains. I could already hear the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush, and the wind whispering through the trees. It felt like a peaceful place until I noticed the cabin itself. It wasn't that it was run down, it just looked wrong. The wooden beams were weathered, a dull gray rather than the rich, warm brown I expected. The small porch had a pair of old rocking chairs, but the paint was chipped and peeling. The windows were dirty, covered in layers of dust that made it hard to see inside. Still, I shrugged it off. It wasn't a luxury rental. I wasn't expecting a 5-star hotel. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and made my way up to the door. The lock was stiff, and it took a little more effort than usual to turn the key. When I finally stepped inside, the smell hit me. Musty, like something had been sitting and used for far too long. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the fading glow outside. I flipped the switch for the overhead light, and the room came to life, though the yellowish glow only made everything look older and more worn. There was a fireplace along the far wall, though it didn't look like it had been used in ages. A couple of mismatched chairs sat around a small, round table. The kitchen area was tucked into the corner, with a few shelves lined with cans of soup and pasta, most of which were clearly expired. A small hallway led to a bedroom at the back of the cabin. I set my bag down and wandered around the room for a moment, trying to get a sense of the place. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No sounds from outside now, just silence. The sun had set completely by the time I finished unpacking. I was tired but decided to go outside for a walk. The air was cooler now, and the crickets had become louder, their constant hum filling the quiet night. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night was thick with trees, nothing but dark, twisted shapes around me. The forest stretched on forever. As I walked, I kept my flashlight trained on the ground in front of me, careful of the roots and rocks that littered the path. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, felt deliberate, like someone or something was watching me. I shook it off as paranoia. I was just in a new place, and the sounds of nature were unfamiliar. I came to a small clearing, a spot where the trees had been cut down some time ago. There was a large rock in the center, half covered in moss. I sat down on it, trying to calm my nerves. The night was too still, and my thoughts began to race. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the cabin, about the entire place. I turned back to the cabin, noticing how dark it had gotten. The only light now came from a faint glow through the dirty windows. Something about it made me uneasy. As I stood up to leave, I heard it. A low creak from somewhere behind me, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart leaped into my throat. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but the woods were empty. No sign of anyone. I took a deep breath and shook my head, trying to calm down. It was probably just a deer or some other animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, more out of instinct than anything else. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and pulled the curtains shut. I didn't need to be paranoid, but something about the woods outside felt wrong. I didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't the discomfort of the bed. It was the silence, the kind of silence that presses on you from all sides, making your mind fill in the gaps. Every creak of the house, every groan of the foundation, made me tense up, wondering if I was alone. I convinced myself I was just being silly. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. My heart raced. I lay there in the darkness, listening intently. The house was silent again, but the air felt thick, like something had changed. Something had shifted. Slowly, I swung my legs off the bed and stood up, my bare feet brushing the cold wooden floor. My flashlight was on the nightstand next to the bed, and I reached for it without making a sound. I didn't want to wake up anything that might be lurking in the dark. The flashlight flickered when I turned it on, but it finally lit up, casting a thin beam of light across the room. I scanned the space. Everything seemed normal. I crept out of the bedroom, heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the cabin was dark, but the moonlight coming through the dirty windows gave it an eerie glow. I slowly made my way to the living room, and that's when I saw it. A door on the far side of the room, one I hadn't noticed before, was slightly ajar. I was sure it had been closed when I arrived. I didn't remember seeing it open, and yet now, there it was, just a crack wide enough for me to see the faint outline of something in the darkness behind it. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to leave, to run out the door and never look back. But another part, the part that wanted answers, urged me forward. I took a step toward the door, every muscle in my body tensed. As I pushed the door open with one hand, the flashlight in the other, I was hit with the overwhelming smell of decay. It was faint but unmistakable. The beam of light landed on something that made my stomach twist. There, on the floor, was a body. It wasn't like I had imagined. It wasn't neatly positioned or carefully hidden. It was sprawled out awkwardly, the limbs twisted at odd angles. The skin was pale, waxy, and almost unnaturally smooth. The smell of rot was thick in the air now, making me gag as I stood frozen in place. My eyes locked on the body. It was a man older than me, dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt. His face was bruised, swollen, his eyes wide open but glazed over. He had clearly been dead for some time. I felt my knees give way beneath me. I collapsed onto the floor, my hands shaking as I pressed them against my face to keep from vomiting. What the hell was going on? How had this man ended up in the cabin? Was he the previous tenant? Was this why the place felt so off? I didn't want to stay here another second. I needed to leave. But then I saw it, the blood-stained knife, half hidden behind a nearby chair. My stomach churned as I realized that someone had been here recently, and they had left in a hurry. My mind raced as I stumbled to my feet. I had to get out of there. I had to. The door slammed behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was another figure. I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running into the night, not caring where I went. The sounds of footsteps behind me kept pace, but I didn't dare turn around. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. My car was parked on the shoulder, just a little ways down. I didn't care if I was going to get into trouble for leaving. I didn't care about anything but getting away from that cabin. By the time I reached my car, my breath was ragged, and the terror that had gripped me still hadn't let go. I fumbled with the keys, my hands too shaky to get the lock undone. Finally, I got in, slammed the door behind me, and started the engine. The tires spun as I tore down the road, not looking back. I never went back to that cabin. When I called the authorities to report what I'd found, they told me they'd check it out. They didn't seem too concerned, but they promised to investigate. Later, I found out that the man in the cabin had been reported missing months earlier. No one knew how he had gotten there or who had left him behind, and the authorities had no answers. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I'll never forget the image of that body, the smell of decay, and the feeling of being watched. It's been years, and I still can't shake the memory. But I can't go back, not even if I wanted to. My name is Brian Hartley. I was 41 when it happened, back in 2016. I lived in Newcastle at the time, working as a mechanic, trying to put things back together after a long divorce. My wife and I had separated the year before, and I was just starting to get used to living on my own again. My daughter was with her mom, and I had no one to answer to, which felt both freeing and hollow. So I started doing something I used to love, spending time in the woods. I found this old cabin online. Not one of those rental things with hot tubs and fresh linen, but a real old hunting cabin way out near Kielder Forest. It wasn't even properly listed on any site. A mate from work, Rob, said his uncle owned it but barely used it anymore. He gave me a number scribbled on an old bedding slip. A week later, I'd paid £100 cash for 3 nights, no paperwork, no questions. I loaded up my truck with tools, firewood, tinned food, a battery radio, a sleeping bag, and a small bottle of whiskey. It was October, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not frozen. Perfect for getting lost and clearing my head. The drive up was longer than I expected. The last half hour was nothing but dirt tracks, deer signs, and fog. I passed 2 other cabins along the way, both of them dark. One of them looked completely abandoned. When I got to mine, the place was just how Rob described it. 1 floor, for small rooms, metal roof, no power. The door was stiff, and the inside smelled like damp wood and mice, but it had what I needed. A wood burner, a few old chairs, a cot, and thick walls. I dropped my bag, lit the stove, cracked the bottle, and by sundown, I was sitting out front watching the forest fall asleep. That first night was calm. I chopped some wood, ate cold stew straight from the tin, and fell asleep early. The forest at night was louder than I remembered. Wind pushed through the trees like water rushing over rocks. I heard something bump the side of the cabin once, but I figured it was a deer, maybe a boar. I'd seen some tracks on the way in. I didn't think much of it. The next day I walked for hours. I took my folding map and tried to follow a loop trail that passed near an old quarry. It was wet and overgrown, and I lost the trail half an hour in. My boots were soaked through. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my legs were shaking and my socks were steaming. I dried everything by the fire, boiled some rice and beans, then sat on the front step as the sun went down again. That's when I saw someone. I was staring through the trees, just letting my eyes drift like you do when you're tired, and I caught movement. Maybe 50 meters back, too far to see clearly, but something upright. Human height. Could have been a tree swaying or a tall shadow. But then it moved again, sharper this time. 2 steps to the left, then nothing. I stood up slowly, watched for another minute. Nothing. I told myself it was a hunter, a hiker, someone just passing through. I walked back inside, bolted the door, and tried to ignore the thud in my chest. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure. Why were they that deep in the woods? Why didn't they have a light? No gear? I didn't hear a vehicle. I didn't hear any branches break. No talking. Nothing. At around 2 a.m., I got up to take a piss. There was a small bucket in the corner of the cabin I'd been using, but this time I went outside. The air was freezing. My breath came out in clouds. The trees were black against a darker sky. I stood there listening. That kind of silence that's not really silent at all. Wind through dry leaves, some owl in the distance, the stove popping faintly inside. Then I heard something. Fast, dry footsteps through leaves. Then stopping. I turned sharply. Couldn't see a thing. The woods just swallowed everything. I waited a full minute, trousers halfway up, heart pounding. Nothing moved. When I got back inside, I locked the door again and pushed the heavy chair up against it. I felt stupid, but it helped me sleep. The next morning was foggy again. I made coffee with boiled rainwater and powdered mix, then went out to check the area. Nothing obvious. No footprints, but the ground was mostly moss and wet leaf cover. Still, I started carrying my small axe with me everywhere after that. Not because I expected to use it, just because it made me feel like I had some control. Around noon, I hiked a few kilometers west, trying to find the quarry again. I took my time, followed a stream for a bit, and eventually ended up on an old dirt road. It wasn't marked on my map, just a single muddy track that curved away into the trees. I followed it for maybe 15 minutes until I saw something strange. There was a tree on the right side of the track. Big, twisted thing. Oak, I think. And carved into the bark at eye level were 2 letters, They looked fresh, maybe a few days old. Sharp lines, no moss in the cuts yet. Same initials as mine. I touched them, then pulled my hand back like it was hot. I looked around slowly. Nothing moved, but my scalp prickled, the way it does when someone stands too close behind you. I turned back, walked faster than I meant to. When I got back to the cabin, the air felt off. Not colder, just heavier. I don't know how else to explain it. Like someone had just been there. I walked around the building twice, axe in hand. Nothing. Inside, I checked my stuff. It was all where I left it. But something on the floor caught my eye. A line of dirt. Just a streak, like someone had stepped in with a muddy boot and then brushed it clean again. The door had been locked. I was sure of it. But the window latch on the back, small, wooden, and old, was slightly loose. It might have been open before. I didn't remember. That night, I didn't drink. I kept the fire low and turned the battery radio to static so I could hear better. I laid in the cot with the axe beside me, fully dressed. It was just past midnight when I heard it, crunching outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Too rhythmic. Too heavy. I sat up and killed the radio. The cabin was silent. More steps. Closer. Then the soft creak of the front step. Just one. Then stillness. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then something tapped the window. Once. Like a fingernail. Then again. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 50. Eventually, I heard the steps again, but moving away. Into the woods. Then nothing. First light, I packed. I shoved everything into the truck without folding or organizing. I didn't even eat. I just wanted out. But when I turned the key, the truck clicked and died. Battery flat. I popped the hood. Wires were cut. Clean. Deliberate. I felt my stomach drop. That kind of fear that makes you dizzy. I looked around. Axe in one hand, wrench in the other. No movement. I waited inside the cabin all day, just pacing, thinking, planning. I had enough food and water, but I didn't want to spend another night. I needed to walk out. The closest farm or road was maybe 8 kilometers back. If I left now, I could make it before dark. But I didn't leave, because around 2 p.m. I saw him, the same shape from before, this time closer, standing halfway between the cabin and the tree line. Just still. I squinted. He was wearing something dark. Jacket or coat. Couldn't see his face. He didn't wave. Didn't move. Just stood. I stepped back inside, heart hammering. Then I made a mistake. I yelled. I told him I was armed. I didn't use names, didn't ask questions. Just shouted once, loud and sharp. Then silence. I watched through the crack in the boards. 10 minutes passed. He was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with the axe in one hand, a knife in the other, barely blinking. At some point near dawn, I heard scratching. Not tapping, scratching. At the back window. I didn't move. Then I heard footsteps, but not outside. Inside. In the other room. I stood slowly, raised the axe. The door to the other room creaked. And then I realized the sound wasn't coming from inside. It was echo. The scratching was louder now. It was both windows, both sides, 2 people. I backed into the corner and waited. Then, nothing. Cold silence. I must have passed out. When I opened my eyes again, it was bright. Morning. Real morning. Blue sky. I grabbed my bag, my axe, everything I could carry. I didn't care about the truck anymore. I walked south toward where I came from. Fast. Every sound felt too sharp. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't drink water. I just kept walking until I hit the old access road. 2 hours later, I found a ranger's hut. Knocked until someone answered. Told them my truck broke down and that I thought I saw someone messing around the cabin. I didn't go into detail. Didn't want them thinking I was crazy. A few days later, I came back with It had been a long week, and the idea of escaping to a small cabin in the woods felt like the perfect way to unwind. My husband, Lucas, had found this place through a friend of a friend. It was secluded, tucked away far from any city or town, making it the ideal spot for us to disconnect and enjoy a quiet weekend together. I needed this. We both did. We left our house early in the morning on Friday, the sun still low in the sky. The drive was peaceful, with little traffic, just the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of birds. Lucas had been excited about the cabin, talking about how relaxing it would be to cook on a wood stove and spend time in nature. I wasn't exactly a nature person, but the thought of being away from our busy lives, away from the constant notifications and calls, seemed perfect. The cabin itself was small, a single-story structure with a stone chimney, a small porch, and large windows that looked out onto the dense woods. The exterior was weathered, the wood darkened by years of exposure to the elements. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find modern amenities, but it had everything we needed: running water, a wood stove, and a few comfortable chairs. We unloaded our bags, set up a few things, and started to settle in. Felt strange at first, the silence. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, nothing to remind us of the world we'd left behind. At first, I felt uneasy, but Lucas seemed perfectly at ease. He made tea, and we sat on the porch, watching the trees sway and listening to the sounds of the forest. I had to admit, the place had a certain charm. As evening approached, we started a fire inside the cabin. The warmth from the fire was a welcome relief from the crisp air outside. Lucas opened a bottle of wine, and we ate dinner, talking about everything and nothing. The evening passed slowly, and by the time the fire had burned down to embers, we were both feeling the effects of the wine and the long drive. Lucas suggested we head to bed, and we made our way to the small bedroom, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the walls. That night, I slept deeply, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around me like a blanket. But it wasn't the peaceful sleep I had hoped for. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise or anything specific that had disturbed me, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. The sound of wind outside had died down, and all I could hear was the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I looked over at Lucas, who was still fast asleep beside me. His steady breathing was comforting, but something in the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I dismissed the feeling and closed my eyes, trying to drift back to sleep. It wasn't until the following morning that the unease started to settle in. I woke up early, as I often did, and found myself staring out the window at the forest beyond. The sun had just risen, casting a soft, golden light over the trees. But there was something about the scene that felt wrong. The trees, tall and silent, seemed almost too still. I tried to shake the feeling, thinking it was just my imagination running wild, but the sensation lingered. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The morning was cool, and the air smelled fresh and clean, typical of a forest. I walked a little ways down a narrow trail behind the cabin, the ground soft under my feet. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick underbrush, but the path was clear, winding its way deeper into the woods. I wasn't gone long before I started to feel that same sense of unease. It wasn't the isolation that bothered me, it was something else. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing, just the woods endless and still. I headed back to the cabin, and Lucas was up by the time I returned. He seemed in good spirits, as usual, making coffee and getting breakfast ready. I mentioned the strange feeling I had earlier, but he just laughed it off, saying it was probably just the quiet of the forest getting to me. I agreed with him, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The day passed uneventfully. We spent some time hiking around the cabin, exploring the area, and collecting firewood. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. But when night came, the sense of unease returned, stronger than before. That night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't stop glancing at the forest just beyond the cabin. The shadows in the trees seemed to move, even though there was no wind. I tried to tell myself it was just the flickering light of the fire playing tricks on my eyes, but the longer I stared, the more I felt like something was watching us. I mentioned it to Lucas, but he didn't seem concerned. He suggested we go to bed early, and I agreed, though I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the silence of the night again. We climbed into bed, and for a while, I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling. But after a while, I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up early again. This time, however, the unease was more than just a feeling. There was something else, something that had changed overnight. I sat up in bed, staring at the small window beside the bed. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but there was a pale light in the sky. I glanced over at Lucas, still fast asleep, and tried to shake the feeling. But when I looked back out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the cabin, was a man. He was barely visible in the early morning light, but there was no mistaking it. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless in the trees, staring directly at the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. The man wasn't moving, just standing there, like he had been there for hours. I didn't want to wake Lucas. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. He didn't seem to notice me staring. I was too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to move. My body felt frozen, my muscles tense. The figure remained there for what felt like an eternity, and just when I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, he slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, if it had been a trick of the light or some kind of strange, twisted dream. But as the sun rose higher and I tried to push the image from my mind, I couldn't help but feel like the woods around us were no longer as safe as they had seemed before. Lucas woke up a little later, and I didn't tell him about what I saw. I didn't want to worry him. Instead, I kept busy, preparing breakfast and acting as normal as I could. But every now and then, my eyes would drift to the window, half expecting to see that same figure again. The day passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as we sat by the fire again, I kept watching the trees. The shadows seemed darker than before, the silence more oppressive. I was almost relieved when we decided to go to bed early again, hoping that sleep would take away the growing sense of dread. But it didn't. Couldn't sleep. Every little creak of the cabin, every rustle in the trees, made my heart race. I lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the fear wouldn't go away. At some point in the night, I heard something, a faint tapping on the window, just beyond the edge of the cabin. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing came after that. The noise stopped. I lay there in the dark, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. It felt like the longest night of my life. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin early. Neither of us said a word during the drive back, but I could tell Lucas was just as relieved as I was to leave. We never spoke of the figure in the woods, and I never told him about the tapping on the window. But that feeling, the one that something was watching us, never truly left. I don't know what happened that weekend, or what that man was doing out there. But I know one thing, I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't know what was out there in those woods, but I'm certain I don't want to find out. It was late autumn, and the cabin I had rented was nestled deep in the forest of the French countryside, far from any towns or other homes. The air was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and wood smoke, the kind of scent that fills your lungs and makes you feel both grounded and alone at the same time. I'd come to this remote cabin to get away from everything: work, city noise, people. A much-needed escape. The cabin was small but sturdy, a two-story structure with a rough-hewn wooden exterior. Inside, it was rustic but well-maintained, with thick wooden beams supporting the ceiling and a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. I had no particular plans for my stay other than to enjoy the solitude, maybe read a few books, take long walks through the forest, and forget about everything that had been weighing on my mind. At first, the silence was comforting. No cars, no phones ringing, no hum of city life. Just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the sound of birds in the distance. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I arrived just as dusk was settling in, the sun disappearing behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I unpacked my bags, started a fire in the hearth, and made myself a simple meal of pasta and wine. The warmth from the fire and the flickering light on the walls made the cabin feel cozy, almost welcoming. But as the night wore on, a subtle unease began to settle in. It was hard to explain, but something about the stillness outside, the darkness closing in, started to feel wrong. The first odd thing happened around midnight. I was reading a book by the fire, the crackle of burning was the only sound in the room, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. A rustling, like someone, was moving through the underbrush near the cabin. I set my book down, straining my ears to hear. The noise stopped for a moment, then came again, a soft shuffle of feet on leaves and twigs. My heart started to pick up pace. At first, I thought it could be an animal, a deer or a boar maybe, but the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't the scurry of a creature running away, but rather the slow, cautious movement of someone or something approaching the cabin. I stood up, unsure of what to do. The idea of going outside to investigate seemed reckless. I wasn't equipped to deal with anything out there, and besides, I was alone. I decided to ignore it, convinced it was just my imagination or a trick of the wind. After all, the forest was full of life. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds outside grew more distinct, the occasional crack of a twig breaking, the soft rustling of leaves. It was as if someone or something was circling the cabin, trying to remain hidden but failing. I pushed the thought from my mind. I was being paranoid, I told myself. It was just the isolation getting to me, the darkness playing tricks on my mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fire in the hearth had long since burned down to embers, casting only faint shadows around the room. The silence was almost suffocating now, and the coldness of the night seemed to seep deeper into my bones. I went to bed, locking the door behind me, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises outside, soft whispers on the wind, the creak of wood in the trees. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind would race, imagining someone standing just outside the window, watching me. The sounds of the forest no longer felt peaceful. They felt threatening. The next day, I decided to take a walk. The sunlight felt good on my skin, and I hoped that some fresh air would clear my mind. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The cabin sat on a small hill with a sweeping view of the forest below. The trees were starting to shed their leaves, the ground covered in a blanket of orange and brown. As I walked further into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I tried to dismiss it, but the feeling lingered, like eyes on the back of my neck. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but each time I turned around, there was nothing, just the empty, quiet woods stretching out behind me. Around midday, I came across a small stream, its water running clear and cold over the smooth rocks. The sun was high in the sky now, and the warmth had made the air feel lighter. I sat by the water for a while, trying to shake off the unease that had been following me since last night. It helped for a moment, but as I stood to leave, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still crisp in the damp soil. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Someone had been walking in the woods, just a short distance behind me, and they had come this way. The footprints led off in the direction of the cabin. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Could have been anyone, I told myself. Maybe someone from a neighboring cabin, though I hadn't seen any signs of life nearby. Maybe it was just another hiker. But as I looked down at the tracks, I noticed something even more unsettling. The prints were too deliberate, too careful. They weren't the signs of someone lost or wandering. They were the steps of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart pounding. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that the forest was full of people, but the deeper I ventured into those woods, the more I felt the eyes on me. That evening, I stayed inside the cabin. The fire was low, casting long shadows on the walls. I bolted the door shut again, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The wind howled outside, and every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, like it was groaning under the weight of the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, and it wasn't just my imagination. Then, just before midnight, I heard it again, the rustling outside. This time, it wasn't faint. It was close. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and crept to the window, peeking out through the curtains. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure standing just outside, too close to the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was a person, standing motionless in the dark. I held my breath, hoping they hadn't seen me, but the figure didn't move. They just stood there, staring at the cabin. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the woods, but who could it be? Was it the same person whose footprints I'd found? I had no way of knowing. Whoever they were, they hadn't made a move yet. The night dragged on, the figure never leaving my sight. The cabin felt smaller, more claustrophobic. I didn't dare leave to confront the person outside. I had no idea what they wanted, and the idea of stepping out into the dark, unprotected, was terrifying. Finally, when the figure seemed to turn and walk away, I felt a surge of relief. But I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed awake, listening to every sound, every creak of the wood, terrified that they would return. The next morning, I left. I packed my things, not bothering to stay another night. I'd come here to escape, but all I'd found was fear. As I drove away, the cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. I didn't know who or what had been lurking in those woods, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that cabin again. It was late October, just before the full chill of winter hit the northern edge of New York. The air was crisp, dry, and the kind of cold that gnaws at your bones. I had been working as a forester for the past 3 years, managing tree health in some of the more remote parts of the Adirondack Mountains. I was used to being alone in the woods, but something about this trip felt different. It was supposed to be just another weekend at the cabin my grandfather left me, a place I had spent a lot of time in over the years, but the atmosphere felt off. The cabin was tucked away, far enough from the main road that the isolation was complete. The nearest town, a small village called West Branch, was about a half-hour drive. The cabin itself was old. My grandfather had built it in the early 70s, and despite its age, it had held up better than most places. The wood, a dark red pine, still had that smell of fresh sap if you knew how to catch it on the wind. The windows were small, the roof slanted, and the porch was creaky. I liked it that way. It felt like home. When I arrived late that Friday afternoon, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. I unpacked my gear quickly, set up the wood stove, and started a fire in the fireplace. It had been a long week, and the quiet of the cabin seemed like the perfect escape. My plan was simple: stay the weekend, do a little reading, maybe take a hike in the morning to check the traps I'd set earlier in the week. Nothing too strenuous. I had brought a few books, a bottle of whiskey, and a pack of cigarettes for good measure. That night, I ate a simple dinner: spaghetti, a can of beans, and some bread I'd picked up from a local bakery. As the fire crackled, I poured myself a drink and stared at the flames, letting the warmth seep into my bones. I didn't think much about it, but the solitude felt more intense than usual, like the silence was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. Around midnight, I went outside to smoke a cigarette on the porch. The air had gotten colder, and the sky was thick with clouds. It would rain by morning, I was sure of it. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches in the trees, making everything feel a little more alive than it should. I didn't mind the wind, though. The trees around the cabin were solid, sturdy. If anything, they made me feel protected. I took a long drag, watching the smoke curl up into the night. That's when I heard it. A twig snap, distant but sharp, followed by another. I froze, listening. There was something wrong about it. The noise was too deliberate, too intentional. Someone or something was out there. I stood still for a few moments, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But there was no mistaking the sound. It was a human footstep, slow, deliberate. I didn't move, not yet. The cabin was small, and the woods around it thick. The trees loomed over the cabin like silent giants, their branches reaching out, creaking in the wind. But this was different. This wasn't the usual night sounds. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly put out the cigarette, my eyes scanning the dark beyond the porch. The cabin was tucked against the base of a hill, with the woods stretching out in every direction. There was nowhere for someone to hide without being noticed. I had hiked these woods for years. I thought I saw a movement in the shadows at the tree line, a figure, but I couldn't be sure. It was too dark, and the flickering light from the fire barely reached that far. The air grew heavier, and my breath came out in short bursts, visible in the cold air. I had no weapon, no rifle, no pistol. It felt strange, being out here alone without anything to protect myself. I had been through plenty of rough patches in these woods, but this felt different. I wasn't just being paranoid. Something was wrong. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to face whatever was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay locked inside either. Whoever or whatever was lurking outside would know I was here, and if I didn't act fast, it might have a chance to get closer. I grabbed a small flashlight from the table and slowly opened the front door. The cold hit me immediately, and I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the darkness with the light. The beam flickered over the trees, but there was no sign of movement. Then, as I stepped off the porch and into the dirt path leading to the woods, the flashlight caught something that sent a jolt of cold fear straight into my stomach. It was a set of footprints in the mud, fresh, with the edges still sharp. Whoever had been out there wasn't far off. The prints led into the trees. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I wasn't stupid. I knew what I was getting into, but I had to know. I had to see who or what was out there. I followed the tracks, my boots crunching against the leaves, the beam of the flashlight dancing over the ground. The further I went, the deeper into the woods I walked, the more the silence pressed in. The trees were tall here, so tall that they blocked out most of the sky. The air felt dense, heavy with the scent of pine and earth, the weight of it almost suffocating. I don't know how far I went before I saw it. The edge of something that shouldn't have been there. Tarp, black, ragged. It was draped over a low branch, hanging off the side of an old log. At first, I thought it was a piece of garbage, but something about it felt wrong. A sense of dread washed over me. I stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight reflecting off something shiny beneath the tarp. A trap, a snare, set up low to the ground, with a series of sharp metal teeth, glistening in the weak light. My heart raced. I backed away from it slowly, careful not to disturb anything. The last thing I wanted was to trigger some kind of mechanism. And then I heard it again, a branch snapping behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of a footstep. I wasn't alone. I spun around, flashlight raised, but there was nothing but the dark, thick forest and the weight of my breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who was out here? Why? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran, back toward the cabin, my feet pounding against the earth, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The night was alive with sounds now, the rustle of the leaves, the distant snap of branches, and all of it seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The darkness was closing in. I reached the cabin door in what felt like a heartbeat. I slammed it shut behind me, bolting it quickly, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands trembled. I had no idea what I had just run from, but I knew one thing: I wasn't alone. The rest of the night was spent in a feverish panic. I checked every window, bolted every door, and even set up a few makeshift traps of my own, though I knew they were no match for whatever or whoever was out there. By morning, the rain had started, washing away the footprints and the remnants of the night's terror. But the feeling, that lingering sense of dread, never left me. I spent the next few hours nervously packing up, ready to leave. I wasn't about to stick around. As I started the truck and drove away from the cabin, I looked back once, through the rearview mirror, at the trees behind me. There was nothing, no figure, no movement, just the fog of the morning rain hanging in the air. And that's when it hit me. There was no way anyone would have been able to move through those woods so quietly, so precisely. Not without practice, not without knowing every inch of the land, every tree, every shadow. It wasn't a person out there. It was something else. Something that knew this place far better than I did. Something that I had no intention of finding again. I drove straight through the rain, my hands gripping the wheel, the road stretching out in front of me. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be back. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was the summer of 2015 when I decided to take a trip out into the mountains for a week of solitude. At 29, I'd spent most of my life living in the city, and work had been wearing me thin. A couple of months of endless deadlines and late nights had drained the life out of me, so I needed a break. I wanted to get away from everything, no phone, no emails, no distractions. Just peace and quiet, with the mountains as my backdrop. A friend of mine, Jeff, had a cabin he had inherited from his grandfather deep in the hills of eastern Oregon. He'd invited me there a few times, but I'd always found an excuse not to go. The cabin was old, barely maintained, and in a location so remote that even Jeff had started to talk about selling it off. I had never considered it seriously, but something about the idea of being completely isolated intrigued me. So when I mentioned needing some time away, Jeff offered me the cabin, and I didn't hesitate. I thought it would be a perfect way to disconnect and clear my mind. The drive was long, a few hours outside of Portland. The further I drove, the fewer cars I saw, and the more the landscape changed. The city's sharp lines gave way to curves and hills, eventually melting into towering trees that blocked out the sun in some places. The winding roads were narrow, with no guardrails, and it felt like I was heading deeper into the wilderness. I followed the route Jeff had given me, taking mental notes as the scenery grew more and more isolated. Eventually, I arrived. The cabin wasn't much, a simple two-story structure that looked like it could use a coat of paint and a good repair on the porch. It was nestled at the foot of a hill, surrounded by dense trees. The air was heavy with the smell of pine, damp earth, and the faint scent of decay from the woods. The cabin's roof was dark with age, the windows were a little crooked, and the wood was weathered, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the door. It creaked as I opened it, a sound that would set the tone for the whole trip. Inside, the cabin was simple, furnished with what looked like a mix of old pieces. A worn-out couch, a rickety dining table, and a fireplace that looked like it had been used more for storage than warmth. The floor was made of rough pine, scratched and uneven, and the walls were adorned with photographs of people I didn't recognize, most likely distant relatives of Jeff's grandfather. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked, set up a few things, and then made my way outside to get a feel for the area. The land around the cabin was thick with trees, and there were small trails leading into the woods, but I had no intention of venturing too far that day. I was content to sit on the porch, sip on some coffee, and listen to the sounds of the forest. The breeze rustled the leaves, and every so often, a bird would call out in the distance. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. That evening, after I cooked myself a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, I settled in front of the fireplace with a book. It was a quiet night, the kind where the crackle of the fire was the loudest sound in the room. The darkness outside felt alive, like something was watching, but I chalked it up to the isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 10 p.m., I heard something. It started as a soft thud, like a branch falling in the woods. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I heard it again, a dull, rhythmic thumping. I stood up, walked to the window, and peered out into the darkness, my breath fogging up the glass. I couldn't see anything, No movement, no animals, just the thick shadows of the trees. The sound stopped. I turned away from the window and tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was an animal or perhaps just the wind. I went back to the couch and tried to distract myself with the book again. The thumping came again, louder this time, closer. It was unmistakable, something was out there. I stood still, my heart racing. It was coming from the back of the cabin, the direction of the woods. The noise sounded like footsteps, deliberate and heavy, as if someone or something was walking around the cabin. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was a person, but who would be out here so far from any road or town? I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The noise was too calculated, too human. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped cautiously out onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing but trees and the distant shape of the hills. The thumping had stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening. The air felt still, unnaturally so. My eyes scanned the shadows, waiting for something to move. I expected an animal to dart out at any moment, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The feeling of being watched never left me, though, and I spent the rest of the night with the light on, the shadows outside seeming to press in closer as the hours stretched on. The next day, I decided to go for a walk. The weather was still clear, the sun peeking through the clouds, and I figured that some fresh air might clear my head. The noise from the previous night still lingered in the back of my mind, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to overreact. I was alone, yes, but that didn't mean there was something out there to fear. I followed one of the trails behind the cabin, my boots crunching on the dry leaves as I made my way deeper into the woods. The forest was dense here, with trees so close together that their branches intertwined above me, blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt different from the usual wilderness, more oppressive, like the trees were closing in on me. I came to a clearing after about an hour of walking. There I saw it, a small structure barely more than a shed. It was old, its wood gray and cracked with age, the roof sagging and partially caved in. I hadn't seen it when I arrived the day before. It must have been further back than I thought. Curiosity got the best of me, and I walked up to the shed. It had no door, just a gaping hole in the front, and the air around it smelled sour, like rot. I peered inside, but it was empty except for some broken furniture and old, weathered tools. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart beat faster, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the back of the shed, partially buried in the dirt, was an old wooden box. It was small, with iron hinges that had rusted over the years. The box seemed out of place. Not something you'd expect to find in an abandoned shed. I bent down to get a closer look, my flashlight flickering in the dim light. The box was old, but it hadn't decayed as much as the rest of the shed. It seemed strangely well preserved. Without thinking too much about it, I reached down and tried to pull it out of the dirt. Just as my fingers brushed the box, I heard something. A sound, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a rustling sound, like something was moving through the trees. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The rustling grew louder, closer. Something was out there. I quickly grabbed the box, stuffed it into my bag, and stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The rustling stopped abruptly. Silence. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I didn't. I didn't know why. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I just needed to get back to the cabin. So, I did what felt safest. I walked back slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees, half expecting something to jump out at me. As I reached the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I locked the door behind me and set the box on the table. I stared at it for a while, wondering if I should open it. The desire to know what was inside gnawed at me, but a deeper instinct told me not to. That night, I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I couldn't sleep. The weight of the silence pressed in on me, and I lay wide awake, waiting for something, anything to happen. The cabin felt like a trap now, and I knew that I couldn't stay there much longer. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care what was in the box anymore. I didn't care about the cabin or the woods or the strange feeling that had gripped me. I just needed to leave. As I drove back down the winding road, I could feel my heart slowing, the tension leaving my body with each mile. But even now, I wonder, what was that noise in the woods? And what was in that box? I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. Some things are better left forgotten. I was 37 when I took the job. It was late September 2013. I was between construction gigs after my last contract ended, and money was starting to dry up fast. A guy I'd worked with told me about a seasonal job that didn't require much skill, just someone willing to spend the winter watching over a cabin deep in the mountains near Salmon Arm, British Columbia. It wasn't even really a job. It was a favor for a rich guy who needed someone to keep an eye on the place while he went overseas for the winter. He offered $5,000 for 3 months. Free food, power, propane, and snowmobile included. I didn't think twice. I said yes. The man who owned the cabin was named Steven. I met him once at a Tim Hortons in town. Middle-aged, soft-spoken, gray hair, clean jacket, nice boots. He gave me a short rundown. He'd inherited the cabin from his uncle a few years ago. It was mostly used for hunting trips and summer getaways. The property had a main cabin and a smaller bunkhouse out back. He said the place was quiet, but the road in and out became unusable after heavy snow. So I'd be stuck up there until spring unless I used the snowmobile. That was fine with me. I didn't need much. A couple books, my laptop, some movies downloaded, and I was set. I drove up the last week of September to settle in. Steven met me there and gave me a quick tour. It wasn't a big place. A log-style cabin with 2 bedrooms, a living area with a big wood stove, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. The bunkhouse was about 20 yards behind the main cabin. Just a small shack with a cot, old furniture, and more dust than anything. There was a generator in the shed and a propane tank out back. The satellite internet barely worked, but I could send emails. Steven had already stocked the pantry and freezer with canned stuff, meat, and a ridiculous amount of powdered milk. He said he didn't want to deal with grocery runs. He told me to lock the place up if I left, not to mess around with anything in the shed besides the generator, and to leave the bunkhouse alone. I thought that last part was weird, but I didn't ask. After he left, it was just me, the trees, and silence. The first couple weeks went by slow. I chopped wood, cleared brush, checked the shed, and got familiar with the snowmobile. I hiked the surrounding area most days, just trying to kill time. Nights were colder than I expected. The wind howled sometimes. It made the trees creak, and every now and then something would hit the roof, branches or pine cones maybe. That's all I thought it was at first. One night, maybe a week in, I thought I heard something outside just after midnight. I was in bed with my headphones in, but the sound cut through. It wasn't an animal. It was a solid thump, like boots on the wooden steps outside. I froze, just lay there holding my breath. The generator was running, and the outside lights were on. I grabbed the small axe I kept beside the door and went out onto the porch. Nothing, just cold wind and the sound of the trees. I checked around the cabin, didn't see any tracks. Figured it was in my head or maybe a branch falling against the wall. Still, I started locking the doors after that. By mid-October, snow had started to fall heavier. The road was gone under a thick layer. I tried not to use the snowmobile much. I wanted to save gas, so I stayed close to the cabin. Around the 3rd week of October, I started noticing small things. Tools weren't where I'd left them. The shed door was open one morning, even though I was sure I'd shut it. One of the gas cans had been moved. I figured maybe animals were getting in, but there were no signs of them. No tracks in the snow, no bite marks or scratches on anything. I swept the whole place for signs of mice or raccoons, but nothing. No droppings, no smells, just things not where I'd left them. One afternoon, I went out to chop firewood and saw something strange. There were boot prints in the snow behind the bunkhouse. Not mine. They came in from the woods, circled the building, then disappeared back into the trees. I followed them for a while, but the wind had started to pick up, and they faded fast. It creeped me out enough that I came back, locked the door, and stayed inside for the rest of the day. That night, I didn't sleep. I emailed Steven and told him I thought someone might be messing around the property. He didn't reply for a couple days. When he finally did, he just said to keep the doors locked and to not worry about the bunkhouse. That again, I started sleeping with the axe next to me. I also set up a couple of noise traps, old soda cans on strings, fishing line across the steps. I even mounted a trail camera pointing at the bunkhouse. The next morning, one of the noise traps had been tripped, but nothing was on the camera. Not even wind-blown snow. It was like someone knew it was there. In early November, the power went out. The generator shut off in the middle of the night. I checked it in the morning. Someone had turned the fuel valve off. That wasn't something that could just happen. You had to crouch beside it and twist a knob under the housing. I filled the tank, restarted it, and went back inside. But I didn't feel safe anymore. That afternoon, I found more boot prints, fresh ones, leading from the woods to the shed. Then they vanished again. I didn't follow them this time. I didn't want to know. I moved my sleeping bag into the main room by the stove and stopped using the bedrooms. I felt too vulnerable back there. I also started keeping all the tools and anything sharp inside. I wasn't about to give someone an axe to use against me. The days started to blur together. I was sleeping in 2-hour stretches, always waking up to check the doors, windows, the camera, the traps. Nothing changed for a while. Then, one morning in late November, I went to check the bunkhouse even though I didn't want to. The door was open. I hadn't been out there in weeks. I stepped inside with the axe ready. Dust was everywhere, same as before. Except now, there were muddy boot prints on the floor. They went in, stopped at the cot, then turned back around. Nothing else was disturbed, nothing taken, but someone had definitely been inside. That night, I sat up until sunrise, holding the axe, listening for any sound. The fire burned low. I didn't sleep. December hit, and everything got worse. The cold was brutal. I kept the stove going constantly. Food was running low. I rationed carefully, sticking mostly to canned beans and pasta. But I was more worried about whoever or whatever kept coming back. One night, I woke up to find the inside of the cabin colder than usual. I got up to check the stove and found the front door open. Not cracked, open. The wind had blown snow in across the floor. There were boot prints inside the cabin. Panicked, I grabbed my axe and swept the whole place. Nothing. Every corner, closet, even under the beds. Nothing. I felt sick. Whoever it was, they'd come in while I was asleep. They'd walked in, stood for a bit, and left, just to let me know they could. I shoved a heavy table in front of the door after that. Nailed boards across the windows. I didn't care anymore about Steven's rules. I was done playing nice. A few days later, I found a dead rabbit nailed to a tree outside the kitchen window. Not hung like an animal trap. Nailed, straight through the chest. Its fur was missing. Its eyes had been taken out. I stood there looking at it until my hands went numb. I took it down, threw it in the woods, and stayed inside for 3 days. The trail camera stopped working after that. Batteries were pulled out. The worst night was just before Christmas. The wind was insane, howling through the trees like a train. I was dozing by the fire when I heard a bang from the shed. Then another. I thought it was the wind, but it kept going, loud, deliberate thuds. I waited until it stopped. Then I threw on my coat, grabbed the axe and flashlight, and went outside. The snow was knee-deep. My breath hung in the air. I crept to the shed, heart pounding, and opened the door slowly. Inside, the generator was running. Everything looked normal except on the wall. Someone had scratched a word into the wooden beam with a knife. It said, "Watching." I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up for 3 days. On Christmas morning, I found the snowmobile flipped over and half buried. Someone had tried to destroy it. I dug it out, fixed what I could, and left it running behind the cabin in case I needed to bail. But I didn't leave. I should have, but I didn't. I think I wanted to know who was doing it. I think I wanted to catch them, That was a mistake. On New Year's Eve, I was in the cabin, cooking a can of soup over the fire. I heard something behind me, a shift in the air. I turned fast, axe in hand, and saw a man standing in the doorway to the back bedroom. He didn't move. He was wearing old hunting gear, faded orange vest, stained jeans, boots caked in mud. His beard was patchy, and his eyes were wide, like he hadn't slept in days. His hands were empty. We stared at each other for what felt like a lifetime. Then he backed up, slowly, and vanished into the shadows. I ran after him. I was never one for cabins. Not in the traditional sense. Sure, I'd gone fishing trips and short hikes over the years with friends or my brother, but I was never the kind of person who dreamed of living out in the woods. I liked plumbing. I liked warm water, and I liked being 5 minutes away from a grocery store. But in the autumn of 2014, my life wasn't exactly in a position where preferences mattered. After my second layoff in 2 years and a messy split from my long-term partner, I needed a place to disappear for a while. That place ended up being a one-room hillside cabin near Kalispell, Montana. It belonged to a guy I'd met through a construction job the year before. Carl, maybe mid-50s, retired early, bought the land back in the 90s when the area was dirt cheap and mostly unknown. The cabin was his side project. One room with stove, no electricity, no cell signal, rainwater collection on the roof, and an outhouse about 30 yards into the trees. He'd offered to let me use it if I ever needed to get away. I didn't take it seriously at the time, but 11 months later I was loading my old Chevy Silverado with canned food, dry goods, and a few gallons of diesel for a generator he kept on site. That generator, by the way, hadn't been turned on in years. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I got in late, just after dark. I remember that ride up the gravel path, tires slipping a little in the mud, brambles brushing the sides of the truck, and the chill creeping through the windows. It had rained that afternoon, and mist still clung to the trees. I parked under a tall pine and took my time unloading. The air was sharper up there, cleaner but quieter in a way that makes you feel like something's missing. The cabin looked just like I remembered from pictures. Sloped roof, wood paneling faded from years of exposure. A set of concrete steps led up to the small porch, and the door creaked louder than it should have when I opened it. Inside, it smelled like cedar, soot, and dust. One cot, one table, one chair. A rusty stovepipe extended up through the roof. There were old pots stacked in a milk crate, some cracked mugs, and a faded lantern on the table. I lit it and checked the windows, only two, one on each side. They had heavy wooden shutters, which I closed right away. That place felt too open. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, got the stove going with the wood Carl had stacked against the wall, and boiled water from a container I brought. I ate cold beans straight from the can and drank tap water I'd filled in Kalispell. I had a cot, a military sleeping bag, and a thick wool blanket. It was all very Spartan, but I told myself that was part of the healing process. I slept fine, at least I think I did. What I remember most about the first night is the stillness. It wasn't like being alone in a house. It was a kind of aloneness that made your ears strain for something. The wind moved the branches, the old roof let out the occasional creak, and every so often I'd hear the far-off thud of something falling. But that was it. The second day I did some exploring. Carl had mentioned a stream about a quarter-mile down a slope to the west. I hiked down with an old jug and found it without much trouble. The water was cold, clear, and moving fast enough that I felt okay filtering some for cooking. I spent a few hours down there just following the bend of it, getting used to being somewhere without other people. I didn't have a phone signal, but I brought a hand crank radio, and around noon I turned it on. Static, a few bursts of chatter. I caught some weather updates, mostly cold, clear nights ahead. That night I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't natural either. A kind of rhythm, soft and spaced out. At first, I thought it was just the stove making noises as it cooled. But then I heard what sounded like footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, heavy. They stopped near the porch. I froze in my sleeping bag. No light in the cabin except the faint glow from the stove. My breath was loud in the silence. I listened hard. The steps didn't return. After about 10 minutes of nothing, I got up, grabbed the lantern, and opened the shutters just a crack. Nothing. Black trees. Fog hanging low like a ceiling. I didn't open the door. The next morning I went outside, checked the area around the porch. Mud was still wet from the rain earlier that week. I found nothing. Not a single print. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer. They make weird sounds sometimes. But it hadn't felt like an animal. That was the first time I noticed things didn't feel right. Over the next few days I kept busy, cutting kindling, boiling water, hiking short distances and marking trees with orange tape to avoid getting turned around. But every night something would change. One night it was the smell, like something dead nearby. I couldn't find a carcass, but the scent hung thick around the cabin, especially near the outhouse. It went away by morning. Another night I woke to tapping on the shutters this time. Not scratching, not branches in the wind. Tapping like fingers or knuckles. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide in the dark, holding my breath like a kid scared of a nightmare. The tapping didn't come again. I started sleeping with the axe beside my cot. Then, one afternoon, I found something at the stream that made my stomach turn. A pile of rocks stacked deliberately. 5 of them. On top of the highest one was a dead squirrel. Not torn up, not eaten, just placed there, stiff, its eyes missing. I knocked the pile over and walked straight back to the cabin. I locked the door from the inside with a bar Carl had installed. I didn't go out again that day. That night, something moved around the cabin. I heard it walking, pausing, circling, the sound of twigs snapping. Once, something brushed the window, just once, then silence. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found prints in the mud. Bare feet, human, too large to be a woman's, too narrow for someone heavy. They circled the cabin, stopped at the window, then disappeared into the woods. The hair on my arms stood straight up. I stayed in the cabin for most of the next 2 days. I didn't use the outhouse anymore. I kept a 5-gallon bucket inside and dumped it away from the cabin at midday when the light was strongest. I cooked less. I kept the stove low at night to avoid drawing attention. I didn't use the lantern unless I had to. On the 9th day, just after sunset, I heard something metal hit the ground outside. It sounded close, like something dropped. I didn't move. Then I heard it again, this time louder. A clattering noise. When I opened the door the next morning, I saw the hatch on the diesel generator had been pulled open. One of the fuel cans was on its side, still sealed, but moved. The prints were back. Same ones. Bare feet. Whoever it was, they were close. They watched me. They knew the cabin, the layout. They were waiting. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up with the axe, the lantern low, and the stove barely burning. I listened, and around 3 a.m., I heard the porch creak. Then silence. Then the sound of someone dragging something, slow, scraping over wood. I sat frozen. The door held. Nothing else happened. By sunrise, they were gone again. I knew I had to leave. I packed fast. I didn't care about half the gear. I loaded what I could, dumped water, stomped out the fire, and locked the cabin behind me. When I got to the truck, my heart sank. The tires had been slashed. All 4 of them. They were deep cuts, knife cuts, clean and deliberate. My toolbox had been emptied. Tools gone. The jack was missing too. I was 14 miles from the nearest road, maybe 5 or 6 hours on foot if I moved fast. I took my pack, filled it with food and water, and started walking. I didn't look back at the cabin. I stuck to the old trail I came in on. The forest was quiet. No birds, no rustling, just the sound of my own boots and the occasional snapping branch. I stopped only once to drink. Then I heard the sound again. Footsteps. Behind me. Not close, but there. I didn't run. I just moved faster. My legs burned. My chest ached. I kept my ears open, but the sounds came and went. Just when I thought I imagined them, they'd come again. A twig snap, a crunch, a breath. took me until just after dark to reach the gravel road. I waited, standing in the middle until a Forest Service truck came by. The guy inside asked if I was okay. I nodded. I didn't say much. He dropped me at the ranger station. I didn't tell them the full story. Just said I ran into a bad situation at a cabin and left my truck there. They offered to call someone for me. I said I'd figure it out. I took a bus back to Kalispell the next day. A few weeks later, Carl called. He'd gone up to check the cabin after I told him something spooked me. He found the front door open, one of the shutters torn off. The generator was missing. The axe was gone. No sign of anyone, but he said the whole place had been trashed. He asked if I wanted to go back up with him to clean it. I said no. I never went back. To this day, I don't know. My name is Alan Green. I was 34 years old the year I took that trip, autumn of 2017. I'd just gotten out of a relationship that had drained me for nearly 4 years. There was no cheating or drama or some big explosive moment. We just ended, faded. Her stuff was out of the apartment in under a week, and I suddenly had too much time and space on my hands. I wasn't looking for therapy or to find myself. I just wanted to get out of the city for a while, hear something other than cars and sirens. I wanted cold air, silence, space. I rented a cabin through a site I found online. It was cheap, tucked into the hills outside a small town called North Fork, Wyoming, population under 2,000. The pictures showed a plain wooden place, nothing fancy. A fire pit, 1 bedroom, propane stove, and an old cast iron heater in the corner of the living room. It was about 3 hours from the closest airport and down a long gravel road that didn't show up on Google Maps. That was exactly what I wanted. No signal, no neighbors, no noise. Just time to clear my head. I flew into Casper, rented a black Jeep Cherokee, and headed north. I had food packed in a cooler, firewood in the trunk, and enough batteries to last me a month. I brought an old Winchester rifle my grandfather left me when he died. Not that I was planning to shoot anything, I just felt better having it with me. It was almost dark when I got to North Fork, a narrow main street, maybe 8 blocks long, with a gas station, 2 bars, a grocery, and not much else. I topped off the Jeep, bought a local map, and checked it against the printed instructions the owner of the cabin had sent me. Her name was Martha. She was in her 60s, lived on a farm a few miles away from the property. Her directions were written like something out of a journal. After the second cattle gate, look for a large rock shaped like a boot. Turn left and keep driving for another 10 minutes until you see a red flag on a fence post. Took me a while, but I found it. That gravel road seemed to go on forever. No lights, just trees and brush and dirt. The occasional flash of deer eyes in my high beams. I passed the red flag. Then I saw the cabin. It was smaller than it looked in the pictures. 1 story, dark red siding, a tin roof, and smoke already curling from the chimney. That surprised me. I hadn't asked anyone to prep the place for me. Maybe Martha had a local keep an eye on it. The front door was unlocked. Inside, it smelled like cedar and old dust. There was a small table, a couch that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, and a single yellow light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I found the switch for the generator out back, flicked it on, and watched the room come to life. I checked every room. There wasn't much, just the bedroom, a little bathroom with a compost toilet, and a closet with some canned goods and cleaning supplies. Everything seemed in order. I brought in my stuff, locked the door behind me, and started a fire in the stove. The first night, I slept like a corpse. The next 3 days were what I wanted them to be: quiet. I woke up early, made coffee on the propane burner, and sat outside watching the sun rise through the trees. The mornings were cold, always under 40 degrees, but the afternoons warmed up just enough to feel like early fall. I took walks through the forest behind the cabin, never straying too far. The air out there felt heavy and clean, and the silence pressed against my ears in a way that almost made me dizzy. By the 4th day, I stopped checking my phone. No bars anyway. I read, chopped wood, and wrote in a notebook for no one in particular. I started to feel like I could actually breathe again. Then, on the fifth night, things started to feel off. I was in bed by 10 p.m. Most nights, the forest was still. But that night, I heard something just after midnight. A short, scraping sound, like something brushing across the side of the cabin. I sat up, held my breath. Nothing. I got out of bed, went to the living room, and stood in the dark for a while. No sound. I figured it might have been a branch or maybe a deer. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. On the north side of the cabin, just beneath one of the small windows, I saw something strange. A boot print, clear as day in the soft dirt. Human, no tread, smooth sole, like an old work boot. I stared at it for a long time, looked around, saw no other tracks. I didn't know what to do with it, so I did nothing. Just watched the trees for a while and tried to shake it off. That night, I brought the Winchester into the bedroom. I kept telling myself it was nothing. But when I went outside the next morning, I found 2 more prints. These were closer to the tree line. They weren't fresh, but they weren't there the day before. I knew that for a fact. I was starting to feel exposed, like someone had been watching me from the trees. But why? And from where? There were no neighbors for miles, and even if there were hunters out here, they wouldn't be creeping up to my cabin in the middle of the night. I thought about packing up, but I told myself it could have been anyone. Maybe even Martha or some old local coming to check on the place. I didn't want to overreact. That night, I moved the couch against the front door and slept with the rifle on the floor beside me. At 3:27 a.m., I woke up to a noise that still makes my heart race. It was a slow, deliberate knock on the back wall of the cabin. Not the door, the wall. 3 knocks, nothing else. I didn't move for almost 10 minutes, just laid there, barely breathing. My ears were ringing. I got out of bed and grabbed the rifle. The fire had gone out. It was cold, dead quiet. Then another knock, this time on the front wall, a little closer to the window. I don't know what made me do it, but I went to the window and looked out. There was no one there, but I saw something at the edge of the woods. A shape, tall, hunched, like a man standing behind a tree, not moving. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there with the rifle in my lap, waiting for the sun to come up. When it did, I went outside again. This time I found more prints, dozens of them, all around the cabin. Some fresh, some older, and all of them pointed toward the cabin. None were going away from it. That's when I realized. Whoever this was, they had been coming here for days, watching, getting closer, testing. I packed up as fast as I could. I loaded the Jeep, locked the cabin, and didn't bother cleaning up. I was done. But the road out was harder to find than it should have been. That red flag that marked the turn, it was gone, ripped off. I drove in circles for over an hour, retracing my steps until I finally found a set of tire tracks I thought looked familiar. That's when I saw the second cabin. It wasn't on any map. It was tucked deeper into the woods, maybe a mile off the path. The roof had partially caved in. The door was gone. I never would have seen it if I hadn't taken a wrong turn. There were animal bones around it, dozens, arranged in piles, some of them bleached white, others fresh. There were ropes hanging from the trees, like makeshift nooses. A shovel leaned against the side of the structure. I didn't go in. I didn't even stop the car. I backed up until I could turn around and got the hell out of there. I drove straight to the gas station in North Fork and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, hands shaking. I told the clerk I was checking out early. Didn't give a reason, just handed him the keys and left. He didn't ask any questions. When I got home, I looked up the property online again. It was gone. Listing removed. No trace of it. I tried reaching Martha. Her number was disconnected. I even contacted the sheriff's office in the county, just to tell someone what I saw. The deputy I spoke to said there was no record of a cabin at that address. No Martha, no rental. It's been years, and I still don't know what happened. I can't explain the prints, the knocking, the figure in the trees, but I know what I saw. I know someone was out there, and they weren't just passing through. They'd been coming to that cabin for a long time. They knew the land better than I ever could. Maybe they lived out there. Maybe they still do. I sold the Winchester. I haven't gone camping since. I stay in hotels now. Rooms with locks, neighbors, front desks and security cameras. I don't care about the noise anymore. I'll take it over that kind of silence. I still think about those boot prints in the dirt, how they all pointed toward the cabin, never away from it. I was 32 when it happened. The year was 2017. I was living in a small town called Loughton, right on the edge of Epping Forest in Essex. Most people knew me as a pretty quiet guy, someone who worked hard and didn't get involved in drama. I managed deliveries for a construction supply company. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and I liked staying busy. My boss, Martin, was in his early 50s. Ex-military, sharp guy, always looking serious. He ran things tight and didn't take shortcuts. He owned the company and had a decent bit of money. A few years before all this, he bought a little cabin just outside the village of Matching Green. Not much more than a timber structure, but it sat on a bit of land tucked off a back road that wound through thick patches of trees and hedgerows. He used it to get away every other weekend. Sometimes he went hunting out there. Other times, he'd just spend the day clearing brush or sitting alone by a fire pit out back. None of us were ever invited. He wasn't that kind of boss. The only reason I even knew where it was located was because he'd once asked me to drop off some fencing timber near it. Anyway, this all happened in early November, just after Guy Fawkes Night. The air had that thick dampness that settles in for the season. It had been raining on and off for a few days, and the sky was always the same color, just dull gray. I'd taken a late shift to deliver some scaffolding gear to a new site we were prepping over near Sawbridgeworth. The site manager there was behind schedule, so we were running materials down that way after hours just to help him catch up. It was supposed to be a simple run. Take the van out, drop the stuff off, sign the sheet, head home. The route was familiar, A414 east out of Harlow, through a few back lanes that snaked around Matching Green, then back north toward town. I knew those roads like the back of my hand, but when I left the site just before 8 p.m., something in my gut told me not to take the same usual way back. There had been a traffic accident near the main road, and I saw flashing lights when I passed the junction, so I took the narrow lanes. The lanes were old, hedge-lined, just wide enough for a single van. The sort of roads where if someone else is coming the other way, one of you has to reverse 50 yards just to let them pass. I didn't mind them, though. They were quiet, peaceful even sometimes, but that night something felt different. There was this mist real low, like a dirty white film sitting on the road. It wasn't thick enough to hide the trees, but it blurred the edges of everything. My headlights cut through it in streaks, and rain kept ticking against the windshield in that lazy, scattered way. I rolled the window down for a bit because the van heater had fogged up the glass. The smell that came in was that damp, mossy autumn scent. Wet earth, old bark, a little diesel from the exhaust. I was halfway between Matching Green and the next village when I passed the little gravel track that led to Martin's cabin. I didn't think much of it at first. I just glanced at it, but something caught my eye. There was a light, not the kind of warm yellow glow from a porch lamp or an inside bulb. This was harsh, almost white, like a floodlight or maybe even a car's high beams. It wasn't aimed at the road, but I could see it bouncing through the trees. Strange thing was, Martin had never installed a floodlight. I remembered that clearly. He'd always joked about not wanting to disturb the natural peace out there. I kept driving for about 10 seconds before I slowed down. Something about that light bugged me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was because the whole area was so empty and quiet that even the smallest thing stood out. Whatever it was, I stopped the van, backed it up carefully until I was at the gravel turnoff again. I sat there for a moment with the engine idling, just watching the woods. The light flickered slightly, then it moved. That's when I knew it wasn't a floodlight. It was coming from something handheld like a torch or maybe a headlamp. I turned the engine off and opened the door, just stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no animals. Just the sound of rain tapping against leaves and the quiet hiss of mist clinging to the ground. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Probably Martin was out there doing something, but it didn't sit right. He wasn't supposed to be there that weekend. I remembered him saying earlier that week that he had a dinner with his daughter down in London. Still, it wasn't my place to snoop. I shut the door, started the van again, and began to roll forward. But I only got about 30 feet when I heard something. A metallic clink. Not loud, just a quick, sharp sound, like something light tapping against something hard. I stopped again. This time, I cut the engine and headlights completely. Total darkness. I could see the white light flickering faintly through the trees again. It was farther in now, deeper down the track, moving slowly. Then it stopped. That's when I noticed something else. There was a second light. It was much dimmer, reddish in color, barely visible, almost like the glow of a dying cigarette. But it wasn't steady. It pulsed slightly, in a way that made me think of a radio or a signal lamp. It was strange. I couldn't figure it out. I got out of the van again, quietly this time, and stepped off the road into the wet grass. I didn't know why I did it, just a bad feeling in my chest. My boots sank slightly into the mud, and the air smelled thick, like wet leaves and something else, like rust or old nails. I moved up the gravel path slowly, careful not to crunch too loud. After about 30 yards, I could see the outline of the cabin. The windows were dark. No smoke from the chimney, but that light, bright and white, was coming from around the side, like someone had set up a work light near the back. I stopped near a tree, crouched low. I was about to turn back when I heard footsteps. Not heavy, but deliberate. Someone walking slowly. I couldn't see them yet. Then a shadow moved across the far side of the cabin. It wasn't Martin. Whoever it was, they were shorter, bulkier in build. They were wearing a hood and carrying something in one hand. It looked like a pry bar. I watched them crouch near the side window and tap at something. Metal on glass. The light shifted again. That second, dim red light I'd seen earlier blinked on and off twice, like a signal. That's when it hit me. There were at least two people out there. One at the cabin and one farther back in the woods with some kind of low beacon. I started to get this deep, sick feeling in my gut. This wasn't someone breaking in for valuables. Martin didn't keep anything worth stealing out there. It was too far off the grid for casual burglars. This was something else. I started backing away slowly. I got maybe 5 paces before I stepped on a branch. The crack it made was loud, way too loud. The figure near the window froze. I dropped down and held my breath. My hands started to shake. The light near the cabin went out. Darkness again. I stayed frozen for what felt like a full minute. I couldn't hear anything, just my heart pounding in my ears. Then I saw movement again, closer this time. Whoever it was had moved away from the cabin and was now near the trees. They were looking for me. I slid my phone out of my jacket and turned off the screen. Didn't even want the risk of it lighting up. I knew I had to get back to the van. I crept backward through the brush, slow as I could, every step measured. I didn't run. Not yet. I just kept low and moved quietly. About halfway back to the van, I saw something on the ground. Plastic bag. The kind used for sealing evidence. It was half buried under leaves. Inside was what looked like a pair of gloves and a small phone like a burner model. I didn't touch it, just kept moving. When I reached the van, I climbed in, locked the doors and started the engine. Headlights on. The road ahead was clear. I didn't look back. I drove straight home that night. Didn't sleep, didn't eat, just sat in my kitchen with the lights off, thinking about what I'd seen. The next morning, I went into work as usual. I didn't say a word to anyone, but Martin wasn't there. He didn't show up that day, or the next. By Friday, his daughter had called the office asking if anyone had heard from him. That's when I told her what I'd seen. Not everything, just enough to get the police involved. They searched the cabin, found signs of forced entry, muddy boot prints, a broken window latch, but no blood, no body, nothing conclusive. Martin was never found. That was 8 years ago. The company was sold off the following spring. His daughter moved away. The cabin still sits out there, boarded up now, overgrown. Every now and then I drive past it. I never stop. They never found out who those men were. The police eventually linked the plastic bag I saw to a wider investigation, some kind of organized group targeting people in remote areas. Landowners, retirees, people who lived off the beaten path. No convictions, just loose connections. But I know what I saw, and I know if I hadn't stopped that night, hadn't heard that clink or seen that light, I might have never realized just how thin the line is between normal life and something much darker. I was 38 when I took a long break from work in early autumn of 2016. I was living in Birmingham at the time, worn down by years of long shifts at a metal fabrication plant. My back ached constantly, my sleep was broken, and I barely spoke to anyone outside of work. My partner had left a few years earlier, and besides my older sister who lived in Leeds, I didn't talk to anyone regularly. I had money saved up, so I quit, sold most of my stuff, and booked a 3-month stay in a rural part of France, the Corrèze region, central France, not far from Uzurch. I found the cabin through a quiet listing on a small travel blog. A British guy had written about this place, no tourist photos, no flashy marketing, just a few grainy pictures and a vague description of a stone cabin in the hills. He said he stayed there to disconnect for a few months and mentioned it was remote, clean, and affordable. The listing had a phone number and nothing else. I called. A French woman answered. She spoke English with a thick accent and asked me 3 times if I understood it was remote and had no Wi-Fi. She said the nearest neighbor was over 1 kilometer away. I told her that was fine. Exactly what I wanted. I wired the deposit and booked the rest in cash. She mailed me an old-fashioned contract and instructions for how to find the place. Paper maps with scribbles and everything. It took me nearly 2 days to drive there from Calais, stopping overnight in Tours. I arrived in Corrèze in early October, just as the trees were starting to turn. It was cloudy that day, with that kind of heavy sky that never quite lets the sun through. The last bit of the drive was a dirt road, narrow and muddy, weaving through forested hills. The directions said to stop at a mossy rock with an old rusted chain hanging from a tree nearby. I saw it eventually and pulled into a clearing. The cabin sat at the far end of the clearing, slumped a little like it had given up on standing straight. It was smaller than I expected, more like a hunter's shelter. Stone walls, dark green shutters on the windows, a sagging slate roof. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it was all very basic. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, a stove that looked older than I was, and shelves with canned goods and old pots. No fridge, no electricity except for a single solar lamp that barely lit anything. There was a shed out back with an axe, some logs, and a few rusted tools. A dry toilet was 20 feet into the woods, behind a wooden slat wall. I set my bags down and just sat for a while, breathing in the quiet. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of trees. Felt right. The first week passed slowly. I read, chopped wood, went on long walks, and made simple meals on the stove. I even tried to write some stuff, though I never showed anyone. The days got shorter quickly, and by the 2nd week, the nights were cold enough that I needed a fire going most evenings. There were no lights from any other houses, no roads in view, just hills and thick woods. It was the most alone I had ever been. Around the 9th or 10th night, I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had made a sound outside. Not an animal rustling, but something harder, like wood on wood. It was short and dull. I stayed in bed, listening. Nothing else came. I figured it was a tree branch falling or something. The next morning, I saw that one of the shutters on the side window had come open. I hadn't touched the shutters since I got there. I always left them closed and latched. It had swung out all the way and was gently knocking against the wall in the wind. I closed it and relatched it. Didn't think much of it. 3 nights later, I woke up again, this time to a tapping sound. Not like before. Lighter, more frequent. I stayed still and listened. It was coming from the front of the cabin. Tap.
Top.
Tap. Pattern, almost. My heart was beating fast. I couldn't see anything. There were no lights. I didn't have a torch with me in bed, and I wasn't about to open the door. I waited. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed awake for another hour, listening. Nothing. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. There were no footprints. The ground was covered in pine needles and wet leaves. But the front shutter was unlatched again, hanging open. The wind was dead still. I told myself it was just the old hardware, maybe rusted. I got a hammer from the shed and reinforced the latch with a nail. I added a small wedge of wood to jam it shut. But the following night, the sound came back. It wasn't tapping this time. It was dragging slow and heavy across the wall, like someone was slowly brushing a stick across the stones. It moved from the back of the cabin to the side, and then stopped. Then the shutter rattled, but the latch held. I didn't sleep after that. I started keeping the axe next to the bed. I also nailed some old blankets over the windows, even though there were already shutters. Something about the way those shutters kept opening didn't sit right. Over the next few days, I stopped exploring. I stayed near the cabin. I checked the shutters constantly, walked the perimeter, even tied a bit of twine between the trees and the walls like a tripwire. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything during the day. But at night, something was moving around. Not every night, but often enough that I stopped feeling rested at all. Once, I thought I heard breathing outside the window, right up against the wall. Just for a moment, I left the lamp on all night, even though it barely helped. I couldn't sleep properly. I would doze off, then jerk awake at the sound of leaves crunching or wood creaking. Sometimes it was nothing. Other times, I was sure something had brushed past the door. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to seem like I'd let fear get the better of me. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was animals, that I was just used to city noise and couldn't handle the quiet. Then, one morning, I found something that changed everything. It was behind the cabin, near the woodshed. A piece of cloth, gray like the kind used in old work jackets. It was caught on a broken branch right at eye level. I touched it. It was damp from dew, but stiff, like it had been there for a while. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't mine. I checked the shed. The axe was still there, but one of the long-handled pruning shears was missing. I hadn't touched those tools. That afternoon, I walked the woods around the cabin in a wide circle. I found signs I hadn't noticed before. A trail barely visible, flattened leaves, some snapped twigs, a shape through the underbrush like someone had passed through more than once. I followed it for a while, curved around and doubled back toward the hills. I never saw anyone, but I got the feeling I was being watched. That night, I barricaded the door. I dragged the table in front of it and stacked the chairs. I placed the axe and a kitchen knife within reach. I didn't undress. I lay in bed fully clothed, waiting. Around midnight, I heard movement again, this time closer. I heard the shutter shift, then the dragging noise again, then a dull thud against the wall. It repeated, thud, thud, then silence. Suddenly, a loud crack, with splintering, the back wall. I bolted up and grabbed the axe. I could hear someone, I was sure now, pressing against the wall, testing it, not trying to break in fully, just making sure I knew they were there. I stood in the middle of the room, every muscle tensed. Then, nothing. No more sounds. Not even footsteps walking away. Just silence. I stayed up till dawn. When the sun rose, I checked the back of the cabin. There were marks on the stone, thin scratches, like from a blade or metal edge. The wood around the window frame had a small chunk missing. Someone had pressed something into it. Not hard, but deliberately. I packed up that morning. I left some of my things behind, just essentials in my bag. I walked out of there and didn't look back. Took me hours to get back to the main road. I hitchhiked to Uzurch and caught a train to Limoges, then to Paris, and flew home 3 days later. I didn't even tell the woman I was leaving. I didn't ask for any refund. I still don't know who it was. Maybe someone living in those woods. Maybe someone who had used that cabin before me and didn't like me being there. There was no phone signal, no trail cams, no one to call for help. What scared me most wasn't the noises or the things I saw. It was the way it was done. Slow, careful, never rushing. Whoever it was had patience. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone, but not enough to make me run immediately. They wanted to watch me come apart, little by little. I still think about that place sometimes. I dream of those shutters swinging open in the dark, of breathing that wasn't mine, of someone standing just beyond the reach of the lamp. And I never go anywhere remote anymore, not alone. Back in early 2017, I was 34, going through one of those stretches in life where nothing felt right. I'd been recently laid off from my job at a construction firm in Birmingham, England, and my long-term relationship had ended around the same time. Everything was just piling on. I needed a break, something to keep me distracted for a while, something to work on with my hands, something away from the city noise and people. That's when I got a call from my Uncle Alan. He was a distant kind of guy, my dad's younger brother, mostly kept to himself, but he had this old cabin up in northern Scotland, near a place called Bewley. It was way out in the woods, not even marked on a proper map. He hadn't been there in years, but he mentioned it needed fixing up. Rotten floorboards, leaks in the roof, maybe some broken windows. Offered me a bit of money to go stay there for a couple weeks and work on it. I figured, why not? I needed money, space, and distraction. I packed up my old gray Vauxhall Astra with some tools, clothes, tinned food, and a bunch of water bottles. Drove all the way up there over the course of a day, stopping at a cheap motel on the way. I got to the edge of the forest by mid-morning the next day. The directions Alan gave me were vague, just a rough drawing and a note saying to park near a wooden fence off the road. Walk east into the woods and I'd see it. After maybe a 15-minute walk through thick trees and mud, I finally spotted it. This rundown one-story wooden cabin, partially hidden by pine. Paint had peeled off most of the walls. One shutter hung loose. The place looked abandoned, like no one had touched it in a decade, but the structure was still standing. I had to kick the door open because the lock had rusted shut. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelled like damp wood and dust. I kept my scarf over my nose for the first hour while I opened all the windows. The main room had a wood-burning stove in the corner, a small kitchenette with a broken tap, and a table covered in mouse droppings. The bedroom was just a mattress on the floor with an old sleeping bag and a half-collapsed dresser. The bathroom didn't even work. No plumbing, but I already expected that. The first few days passed slow. I'd wake up just after sunrise, boil some tea on a little camping stove I brought, and start working. Replaced floorboards in the bedroom first, nailed down a new shutter, patched up a crack in one of the walls. I stayed busy, mostly to keep myself from thinking too much about everything going wrong in my life. There was no reception out there. No signal, no data, no calls. It was just me, the woods, and the sound of wind brushing through the trees. At night, I'd read by a headlamp or just sit and listen. The forest was noisy, but in a natural way. Rustling leaves, far-off bird calls, maybe a fox now and then. It wasn't scary, not yet, but around the fourth night, something started to feel off. It started with small things. I'd leave my toolbox by the kitchen table and find it half-shifted the next morning. Or I'd remember closing a window before bed, but find it wide open when I woke up. I chalked it up to memory lapses, stress maybe, or wind. But by the end of the first week, the feeling changed. Like someone was watching me. I couldn't explain it. There was no noise, no movement. But the silence at night started to feel heavy, like it wasn't just natural stillness. I began hearing soft crunches of leaves just outside the window, too far to make out but close enough to freeze me mid-step. I started sleeping with a hammer next to the mattress. That's when I knew it wasn't just nerves. I never used to be that kind of person. Then came the night I saw the first footprint. It had rained lightly that day. I'd been working outside patching a gap in the roof, so I had boots on, left clear marks leading to and from the front door. But when I came out the next morning, there was a single bare footprint in the mud just outside the window near the bedroom. Not a boot, not a shoe, a bare foot, human. It wasn't mine. I don't walk around barefoot in mud. It looked fresh, clear toes, clear heel, like someone had just stood there watching through the window. I looked around the woods for a full 20 minutes. Nothing. No broken twigs, no trail. I didn't hear anything either, but it changed everything. That was the moment I stopped thinking it was just animals or wind. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the edge of the mattress, hammer in hand, headlamp off. I listened. The wind came in waves, brushing across the roof. Once or twice I heard something move outside, like a shuffle. Maybe a squirrel, maybe not. By morning, nothing had happened, but I was on edge all day. I started double-checking every window and door before bed, moved the table in front of the door, even made a line of flour across the floor inside, something I'd seen in a movie once, to see if anything got disturbed. That night, I heard the knock. 3 slow knocks, not on the door, on the bedroom wall near the head of the mattress, like someone had tapped from outside. Not hard, just enough for me to hear it clearly, and it came around 3 in the morning. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. My headlamp was off, so I couldn't see anything. I didn't turn it on. I just sat there, eyes open, heart thudding. After a minute, I grabbed the hammer, moved slowly to the window, and peeked through the crack. Nothing. No shapes. No movement. Just trees. I didn't go back to sleep after that. The next morning, I walked the whole perimeter. Again, I found a single footprint. Same shape, same size. Still barefoot. This time it was behind the cabin, next to the wall where I'd heard the knocking. Something about that terrified me more than anything before. Someone was out there, watching, moving in silence, leaving almost no trace. In that kind of forest, you hear everything, twigs snapping, brush rustling. But this person moved like they'd lived there all their life. I started keeping a knife on me during the day, hammer by the mattress at night. By the 9th day, I was ready to leave. I didn't care about the money anymore. I packed up most of my stuff and loaded it near the trail to the car. But the problem was that the weather had turned. Heavy rain started early that afternoon. I didn't want to carry everything through thick mud and risk getting stuck in the woods overnight. I figured I'd leave at first light the next day. I shouldn't have waited. That night, I locked the door, nailed a board over the inside of the window near the bedroom, and kept my lamp on the whole time. I didn't even try to sleep. I just sat at the table, back to the wall, hammer in hand, watching the window across the room. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside, coming around the cabin. Then a soft dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled through wet leaves. It circled once, then silence. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just sat and waited. Then, out of the quiet, came this low creaking sound, wood bending, old and warped, not from inside, from the back of the cabin. The back door, the one I hadn't used once, the one I thought was jammed shut. I stood slowly, hammer gripped tight, moved toward the hallway, tried to listen. The sound stopped, then a new sound. From the bedroom, I rushed in. The board over the window had been pushed out. Not all the way, just enough to see in. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I didn't even think. I grabbed the last of my gear and bolted. No headlamp, no torch, just moonlight and instinct. The trail was soaked and slippery. I tripped more than once. I ran hard, smashing into low branches, scraping my arms and face. I just wanted to get out. I reached the car, slammed the door, locked it, and sat in silence for what felt like an hour. Then I drove. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. I got to a petrol station 20 miles away. Blood on my face. Mud all over my legs. I looked insane. Didn't care. I bought a bottle of water, washed my face in the bathroom, and kept driving. I never went back. I told my uncle the cabin was beyond saving, that vandals had trashed it. I don't think he even cared. Said he'd planned to sell the land anyway. A year later, I saw a headline online about someone going missing in that same forest. A hiker, never found, no trace. I don't know who was out there watching me. I don't know how long they'd been doing it, but they weren't trying to scare me. Not at first. They were waiting, patient. If I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be here writing this. Sometimes the scariest things aren't loud. They don't scream or chase or show themselves in the open. Sometimes they're quiet, careful, patient, and they watch. It was mid-October of 2011 when I got the call for a last-minute delivery run. I was working as a logistics contractor for a small freight company in Northwest Pennsylvania, mostly delivering specialized equipment to remote spots, weather stations, logging sites, oil survey stations, things like that. Paid better than you'd think, mostly because no one wanted to do it. The routes weren't on GPS half the time, and most jobs ended with a long hike through forest roads or backcountry trails. Still, I liked the solitude. That Thursday morning, around 9 a.m., I got a call from my supervisor, Dennis. He told me someone had canceled, and they needed a package dropped at a private hunting cabin way up near the Allegheny Forest. It was a long drive for a single box, some kind of backup generator part, but I'd been sitting around for 3 days waiting on work, so I said yes. He texted me the location, and it looked remote. Really remote. One thin dirt road marked on a forest survey map, leading a dozen miles off the main route into dense woodland. Apparently, the guy who ordered the part had hiked out of the woods to call the company's customer line and ask why his gear hadn't arrived. According to Dennis, he sounded pissed, which I didn't care about. I wasn't in customer service. By 11 a.m., I had the package loaded in my company's old Ford Ranger and hit the road. I didn't even know the name of the guy I was delivering to, just an address scrawled across a folded map and a general location. Not that it mattered. We dropped things off all the time without seeing anyone. Just leave it in a dry spot, take a photo, send the timestamp. The sky was heavy with gray clouds when I crossed into the forest. The first hour was paved, then a winding stretch of gravel road. Eventually, I found the turnoff, a narrow rutted track leading into the trees. The sign nailed to the pine at the turn just said Cooper Run Access Road, but it didn't look like it had been maintained in years. Moss had grown between the deep tire ruts. Still, I pushed on. The map said the cabin was another 6 miles down that road. It started raining halfway in. At first, it was a misting drizzle, the kind that makes the windshield grimy but doesn't affect traction. But a mile in, it got heavier. The road turned to wet clay, and the truck fishtailed a few times. I slowed down and shifted into four-wheel drive, crawling along at maybe 10 miles per hour. Trees crowded in on both sides, and the rain soaked through the canopy now in steady sheets. The forest here felt different, older. The trees weren't lined in neat rows like the parts near the highway. This place hadn't been logged in decades. Everything smelled like wet bark and rot. I passed an old rusted gate that had fallen across a side trail and kept going. The air was thick and cold. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the spot marked on the map. There was a clearing off to the right, just wide enough to park the truck. A short trail led into the woods, and maybe 50 yards in, I saw it, the cabin. It was small, one story, with a metal roof and a porch covered in chopped firewood. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a single window glowed faint yellow. I parked, grabbed the box, and made my way down the muddy path. I remember the sound of the rain on the metal roof was louder up close. Came down like nails tapping the tin, fast and steady. I set the box on the porch, took the picture with the timestamp, and turned to leave. That's when I noticed the door was open. Not wide, just a few inches, but it moved slightly, as if nudged by a draft. Should have been locked, or shut at least. With the weather like that, no one would leave their door cracked open. I paused, then looked again. The fire inside was low, more coals than flame, and there was no sign of movement through the small window. Still, I didn't go in. We weren't supposed to interact with the clients, just drop and go. So I headed back to the truck, except the truck wasn't where I left it. I stopped cold in the trail. The truck had been right there, nose into the brush, parked at the edge of the clearing. I hadn't pulled in far because I didn't want to get stuck in the mud. Now the clearing was empty, just puddles and wet grass. I walked forward fast, scanning the area, thinking maybe I'd misjudged the angle or parked on the wrong side of the trail. But there was nothing, no tire marks either. The ground was too wet to hold a clean tread, but it should have at least been churned up from where I reversed in. I stood there for a solid minute, rain soaking into my jacket, heart thumping. My first thought was theft. Maybe I wasn't alone out here. Maybe someone had seen the truck while I was walking up and took it. But I would have heard it. That engine was old and loud, and the forest was dead silent apart from the rain. Then I thought maybe I'd parked farther down than I remembered. I started walking the trail again, back toward the road. I followed it maybe 100 yards, then another 100. But it was just trees and dark, wet branches slapping at my sleeves. No truck, no sound, no sign anyone else had been out there at all. By then I knew something was wrong, really wrong. And the worst part was I had no cell signal. I pulled out my phone and saw the no service message staring back at me. Figured, these woods were full of dead zones. I turned back toward the cabin. Even though every part of me wanted to stay outside, I knew I couldn't stay in the woods overnight with no supplies. I didn't even have a flashlight. The only dry place was that cabin. When I reached the porch again, the door was still cracked open, but wider now, maybe 6 inches. I stepped up, knocked once out of habit, then slowly pushed it open. The inside was warm and smelled like wood smoke. A small oil lamp burned on the table beside the door. The fire had died down to coals, but the room was still warmer than outside. There were 2 chairs, a small cot against the wall, shelves with canned food, tools, a hunting rifle on hooks. No one inside. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer, listening. Then I walked in and shut the door behind me. The latch clicked. That sound echoed. I didn't sit, just stood there dripping on the wooden floor, feeling like I'd stepped into a trap. There were boots by the door, a coat on a hook. Someone lived here. Someone should have been here. I checked the other rooms, if you could call them that. There was a small bathroom, no running water, just a chemical toilet and a cracked mirror, and a closet with gear inside. A backpack, spare lanterns, nothing out of place. No sign of a struggle, but no one else. And that was the strangest part. If the person had gone into the woods, why hadn't I passed them? There was only one path. I locked the door and dragged the heavier of the 2 chairs against it. Then I stoked the fire a little, just enough to stay warm. I didn't touch anything else. I waited. Hours passed. The rain didn't stop. Every so often I thought I heard something outside. Movement, a branch snapping, water sloshing. But when I looked through the window, I couldn't see anything but black trees and mist. I must have fallen asleep just before dawn. When I woke up, it was still raining. A little lighter now, but steady. I sat up fast and looked out the window. Nothing, but the door was unlocked. The latch was turned, and the chair I'd placed against it was lying on its side. I didn't sleepwalk. I don't move around when I sleep. And even if I had, there's no way I could have quietly moved that chair and turned the latch without waking myself. I grabbed the hunting rifle from the wall. It was loaded. The safety was off. That told me something. The owner had expected trouble, or had left in a rush, or hadn't left at all. I opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The box I'd delivered was gone. The muddy path showed prints now, bare feet, wide set, deep in the clay. They weren't mine. They led away from the porch toward the trees, and they hadn't been there the night before. I didn't follow them. I ran. I didn't stop running until I hit the gravel access road over a mile away. My legs were shaking, lungs burning. I found a ranger station just after noon, flagged down an ATV patrol. They called it in. When the troopers went back, the cabin was empty. They found the tire tracks from my truck, but they were faint, as if someone had driven it off slow in the rain. It was eventually recovered 2 towns over, abandoned near a boat launch, engine cold. No fingerprints inside except mine. I gave a report, answered 100 questions, but nothing ever came of it. They never found the man who owned the cabin. His name was Peter Lane, 53 years old, lived out there alone every fall for hunting season. He'd placed the order for the generator part 3 weeks earlier, then never answered his phone again. They found his wallet, his backpack, even his hunting license in the cabin. But not him. He was never seen again. I quit the delivery job that winter, got a position closer to Erie working warehouse inventory. I still think about that night all the time, how my truck vanished, how the door unlocked on its own, how the footprints appeared in the mud after I went to sleep. Someone was out there, and I don't think they ever left.